The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump is traveling to Mexico today to meet with President Enrique Peña Nieto just before delivering this supposedly major speech laying out his immigration policy plan once and for all. Donald Trump tweeting about it, which is actually, Trump communicates more via tweets than through those harebrained spokespeople he hires. No doubt about that. Here is Donald Trump's first tweet about this. I have accepted the invitation of President Enrique Peña Nieto of Mexico and look very much forward to meeting him tomorrow. This is going to be one awkward meeting. Trump is pledging to build a wall, and making Mexico pay for it is part of that plan. Hopefully he can explain to the Mexican president exactly how he's going to make him pay for it. Trump has said that Mexico sends their worst, the rapists and the criminals, over to the U.S. Maybe that will be a topic of conversation at this meeting. I hope Donald Trump talks about the trade deals that he's going to either destroy or ignore, or the taxes that he's going to place on Mexico that would, of course, violate existing trade deals. Here is another tweet from Donald Trump on this issue. I love the Mexican people, but Mexico is not our friend. They're killing us at the border and they're killing us on jobs and trade. Fight. Maybe that tweet will be a topic of conversation with the Mexican president. And I want to suggest that this entire thing backfired on the Mexican president. I think it's possible that the Mexican president invited Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton thinking that Donald Trump wouldn't go and Hillary Clinton would. Trump called his bluff. It is not good. For Trump, it's sort of obvious. If you go, Jason, and meet with a president, that makes you look presidential. That's a win. The problem, though, is that now the Mexican president is legitimizing Donald Trump, which I don't think is really something he wants to do. I think this is a total backfire for the Mexican president.
Yeah, I have no idea why he's actually entertaining his audience and having him to his country. The only thing I can maybe think of is Donald Trump is going to move more of his, let's say, merchandising and job creation to Mexico.
Can you imagine? So publicly, Trump is talking about Mexico, bad, bad, bad. We're going to punish them. We're going to win. We know that at least in the past, Trump was producing, I believe it was his menswear line in Mexico or something like that. Imagine if this is actually a business meeting, right? The public face of it is this is related to Trump's run for president. And he's actually going to say, listen, I want to start making more of my suits. And actually, we want to start using your water supply to make Trump ice bottled water. I don't actually think that's what's going on, but that would be truly amazing. Now, the meeting might also be awkward because the Mexican president has likened Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler and Mussolini at a June 29th press conference with President Barack Obama, as well as the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Ottawa. The Mexican president warned of the dangers of populism in a globalized world and defended comments earlier this year in which he likened Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, saying, hey, Hitler, Mussolini, we all know the result. It was only a call for reflection and for recognition so that we bear in mind what we have achieved and the great deal still to achieve. Tonight is this major, supposedly, Trump immigration speech. I have one primary logistical question that I want answered tonight. What happens to the 11 million undocumented immigrants already in the United States? Donald Trump has already offered at minimum 3 completely different possibilities. It's not clear which one he believes now. He maybe will repeat one of those 3 as the real and final piece of his immigration plan tonight, or maybe he will come up with something new altogether. I don't know. We will be watching. I think the Mexican meeting is an absolute mistake by the Mexican president that seems to have completely backfired. Let's talk about fear-mongering. I'm not someone who thinks that there's nothing to be afraid of in modern 2016 society on Earth. Donald Trump has used fear in his campaign to try to get people to vote for him. He's used fear of Hispanic immigrant rapist criminals. He's used fear of Muslims. He's used fear of Hillary Clinton, fear of her allegedly poor health or fear of her lack of trustworthiness or whatever. He's used fear of liberal ideas. He's also used fear of black criminals, and he's made a number of aspects of that sort of central over the last few weeks to his supposed outreach to black voters. And he actually went further this week and started making a case based on pure lies. Let me show you and read to you a tweet that Donald Trump put out this week saying, inner city crime is reaching record levels. African Americans will vote for Trump because they know I will stop the slaughter going on. First of all, this is part of this bizarre outreach to black Americans, which, as I've mentioned, has led Trump really in a rough spot with, as I'll tell you later on in today's show, 0% favorability among black Americans in a recent poll. There are sort of two questions that need to be asked with every single one of Trump's claims. Number one is, if the claims are true, then is this something that Donald Trump would improve as president? But there's a different question that we must ask, which is the claim even true? And with this tweet about inner city crime at record levels, it's not even close to the truth. First of all, there's no actual official category for what an inner city is. So PolitiFact evaluated this claim, and they looked at cities with a population of over 250,000. That's how they defined large cities. The truth is, and this is using FBI data, this isn't Obama data, it's not Trump data, it's not Hillary Clinton data, this is FBI data. When you look at the crime rate, the rate, not the number of crimes, in these major cities, it has actually been on the decline. If you go back to the early to mid 1990s and just look at the trend line, we have seen crime decline in major cities. If we look more specifically at homicide rates, those have also been declining nationally since the early to mid 1990s. There are, and this is where, sometimes Trump will sort of grab on to the littlest sliver of something that could be distorted to maybe make it seem like there's some truth there. Over the last year, there is a group of cities that have seen an uptick in crime over the last year. When you look at the trend line nationally, for all cities over 250,000 in population, the violent crime rate, the homicide rate, the total crime rate has been decreasing. So we've never actually lived in a time where we've seen such sustained decreases in the crime rate, decreases in violence. If you look at the world and compare it now to 100 years ago, to 200 years ago, to 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, a relatively small percentage of the world population is dealing with war zones. A relatively smaller percentage of the world population is in what we would call extreme poverty. Now, I'm not saying it's all glorious sunshine and ginger snaps and waterfalls. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that the problems we're dealing with today, legitimate problems, are problems we've made significant progress on. And Jason, Trump is just fear-mongering with false statistics. And the part that really bothers me is people aren't questioning the statistics. They're going straight to here's how Trump would fix it, when sometimes it doesn't really exist, at least not as Trump is suggesting.
And I think what this is the case kind of sort of like a sports team where a manager gets credit for all of his players doing so well. And it's not really, he doesn't really influence this. I know one news story I heard yesterday was how the Spain's, government is not in session now because of this big debacle going on over there, and their economy has finally been on the uptick for the first time in 5 years.
Not actually related to a break from legislative session, and this also applies to Trump wants to attach, I don't even think Trump really knows the numbers, but there are some who want to attach the crime increase in some cities over the last year to President Obama specifically. And of course, we know that number one, you can't do that the same way that gas prices can't be directly connected to the individual decisions made by a president. But in addition to that, it ignores the broader trend, not only over the nearly 8 years of President Obama's presidency, but dating back 20 or 30 years now. So this stuff will rot your brain. Before you start to think about whether Trump is the solution to the problem, figure out whether he's even accurately representing the problem. And this is in the midst of really, really serious issues with climate change where we should be acting. Corporations getting even more power if TPP were to pass. Medical and scientific progress being stunted by religious ideologues. An economy where income inequality continues to grow. There are real things to be afraid of. Donald Trump saying inner city crime is at an all-time high and he'll fix it. That is not one of those things. Let's talk now about recent polling from Public Policy Polling. This is a poll that has been released in the middle of Donald Trump's completely bogus and pathetic attempts to reach out to black voters. A new PPP poll has Donald Trump polling at 0% statistically with black voters. So first, this is from the poll Trump's favorability based on race. You will see that Trump has a 23% favorability rating from Hispanic voters, a 41% favorability rating from white voters, and just a dash, not even 1% statistically, favorability from black voters. Now, there was another question asked by the poll, which is who would you vote for given only the options of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump? And Trump does way better there. 4% of the African-American electorate saying that they would vote for Donald Trump. 89% saying that they would vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, I know PPP is a liberal polling firm. There's no doubt about that. No one poll is exactly right. They all have a margin of error. But these numbers are not drastically different than what we're seeing in other polls, where sometimes Trump is polling 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7% favorability or support from black voters. I just can't figure it out, Jason. Why aren't black voters supporting Trump? All he did recently was call them uneducated poor people who have nothing and might as well vote for Trump because it's unlikely they would end up any worse off than they already are. That seems like a great appeal to black voters.
Well, they certainly were born, but they weren't born yesterday. They they know that it's a bunch of lies. Everything that comes out of his mouth is just a big, big flaccid statement.
Your life is so terrible, so roll the dice on me has not been a big wave maker in the black community. And when people hear me say, oh, he's polling 0, that doesn't mean there are no black people who like Trump. There's a difference between 0 people and statistically 0 in a representative sample plus or minus 3 percentage points. I'm not a political consultant, but my sense is what's the worst that could happen if you vote for me is not a really strong sort of crafted political message. I don't know if that would convince you to vote for someone.
That's where the campaign managers are at this point. They're like, well, what do we have to lose at this point? We can just say anything we want and we're just going to get some press, and certain demographics of the American population are still going to vote for me.
There's this implicit sort of understanding that by some right-wingers that the Democratic black vote is a bad thing because it shows that Democrats don't actually have to do anything for minority communities because they're just assuming the support of black voters. I find that to actually be quite offensive to non-white voters. This includes the Latino population. This includes the black population. Why is the assumption that when a population overwhelmingly tends to support one political party over another, it's because they don't understand the actualities of what that party is doing? Isn't it possible they've understood that the policies of the Republican Party are just doing nothing for them? I think it's very, very offensive to imply that there is actually nothing other than just sort of optics and the assumption of the vote behind why black voters overwhelmingly support Democratic candidates. I don't buy into it whatsoever.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Ruben Aguilar. Ruben, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member, and I would encourage all of our viewers and listeners to sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. The best way to support this program's existence is by becoming a member on our website. Okay, we do have Hatriot Mail today. I'll remind you what Hatriot Mail is to begin with.
If Ayn Rand and Ronald Reagan had a baby, and suckled that child off the teat of liberty, its cries would sound a little something like Hatriot Mail, written by patriots who hate David Pakman, because America, and because freedom.
So I don't really even think this week's Hatriot Mail needs much of an introduction. It's pretty self-explanatory. Let's take a listen.
I watch your show because I like to stay informed on what the liberal morons are saying. You disparaged a Navy SEAL who was nearly killed during the slaughter at Benghazi. During your video, in which your frail, girly arms were on display as you spat on the integrity of a man who put his life on the line to defend the country, you asked whether his account would change anyone's opinion on Clinton. My answer to that is, who the hell else would if not his? He was there, numbnuts. Here's a bit of advice, scrawny. Go and join the military. Since they're accepting transsexuals now, maybe you can say you're a woman to meet lower physical fitness standards. Then get shipped off to whatever hellhole Obama fecklessly wanders next. You've always been an absurd host, but never have you been this wretched.
Presented, I think, for today, without commentary, because how could I possibly follow that up except to say that we figured out a way to turn the hatriotism into something good. We have a coupon code, Hatriot40, which you can use at davidpakman.com/membership for a very nice discount off of your membership. And my guess is the Hatriots don't like knowing that their ad hominems and insults are turned into a way to actually support and grow the show. Okay, I want to talk about this controversy involving San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who refused to stand during the national anthem a few days ago before a football game. He was asked why. Why wouldn't you stand during the national anthem? And he said that he was motivated to sit during the national anthem by the issues of police brutality, as well as racial injustice in the United States. He had many supporters who liked what he did, and also many, many people who were super angry at him, saying, oh, he's being unpatriotic. How dare Colin Kaepernick not stand during the national anthem? Our soldiers have fought for our flag and freedom of expression, and then he insults them by sitting. To which I say, isn't Colin Kaepernick having the choice to sit or stand during the national anthem part of the freedom of expression that goes with the flag that our members of the military are fighting for? And for those who are calling Colin Kaepernick unpatriotic for pointing out issues that he sees within the United States, think about that double standard. Many of the same people who considered Donald Trump a patriot for going around saying the country's on fire, it's not great, I'm going to make it great again, they think he's a patriot for that, are saying Colin Kaepernick is unpatriotic for pointing out what he sees as the failings of our country. Why isn't Trump being called the traitor for saying the country isn't great anymore? I guess that's different in some way, Jason. And some people are attributing this to, oh, well, Colin Kaepernick is black and this is just a racist thing. I'm sure there are individual racists, but I think that big picture, that is not at the heart of it. It's just the double standard where certain critiques of America, particularly when you're criticizing the first half-black president who happens to be a Democrat, it's okay to critique America then, but if it's Colin Kaepernick critiquing what he sees as race-related injustices, that's not patriotic. That's traitorous.
Yeah, you need to stand up for what you believe in or not stand up for it. I think this is a great thing. I think more athletes should be able to do this, should be able to take a stand or a seat, and by that, have the media have to ask, why didn't you do this? Why did you do this? And it opens up a great conversation, I'd say.
I have no problem with this making headlines. And in fact, that's probably the goal. If you are trying to point to injustices you see, you should have really no problem with media picking up on the fact that you sat. The problem I have is with some of the specific and hypocritical critiques of Colin Kaepernick. And there's another story here that we've talked about. And we've talked about this with Dave Zirin from The Nation many times. The glaring corporatism, faux patriotism, and militarism of American professional sports, Why do athletes even need to listen to the national anthem before starting the game? Even the president is not required to listen to the national anthem before starting their day. In most other countries, in many other countries, the national anthem is not played before sporting events. And my last thought on this, even the national anthem itself in full is sort of a celebration of slavery. A lot of people don't know this, but we only sing part of the national anthem now. Let's put up on the screen the third verse of the national anthem, which references slavery positively, saying, "No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." That is the third verse of the national anthem. No refuge could save the hireling and slave. Others have jumped in and said, hey, wait a second, this actually makes sense. I can understand why Colin Kaepernick wouldn't stand during this. And then some others have critiqued Colin Kaepernick by saying, why is he even involved in this? He's not really black, and also he's rich. So who is he to talk about this stuff? That is the identity politics nonsense. Rodney Harrison, who's a former San Diego Chargers and Patriots safety, who's now a studio analyst on Sunday Night Football, said, I'll tell you this, I'm a black man, and Colin Kaepernick, he's not black. He cannot understand what I face and what other black men and black people face or people of color face on an everyday basis. This is completely toxic, right? I mean, whatever Colin Kaepernick's experience is, he's not more or less allowed to express freedom of speech based on his income or his perceived skin color or any other identity factor. We can have a debate over whether Colin Kaepernick's grievances are valid. We can debate whether the national anthem should or should not be played before professional sporting events. But disqualifying Colin Kaepernick, as many have done, because he doesn't really look that black. Is he black? I don't really know. He's a rich guy who can express these ideas without any real risk to his career because he has so much money and makes however many million dollars a year. That is logically fallacious. It has no bearing on the validity of what he's doing, which I completely support the fact that he's entitled to do. I don't know if you feel differently, Jason.
No, I agree with you definitely. I'm just wondering, why does Rodney Harrison have a problem with this? Shouldn't maybe he should be speaking in some vein? I don't know him as a spokesman for
any issue, yeah.
Anti-racism. And does this discount with this? Is this kind of the Malcolm X kind of thing? At one point, he felt that no white people should be trying to help with the minority movements. Is this the same rhetoric? I think it's kind of dangerous. I don't think it should be the way it is.
Completely dangerous. And I've rejected it wholeheartedly. This is the toxic identity politics stuff where, for example, I was called a white supremacist because I had a critique of some of the tactics used by Black Lives Matter. And because I'm not black, I was actually critiqued and said, who are you to comment on what's going on? And I reject that completely. And we've seen this in many other areas. And I think it's absolutely toxic and ridiculous. And everybody applying that standard to Colin Kaepernick, you're not going to get very far with that amongst rational and clear thinking individuals. I want to follow up real quick on the new California law, which requires children in public and private schools to be vaccinated against 10 different illnesses and eliminates an exemption based on the personal or religious beliefs of the parents. So mandatory vaccination in California for public and private school attendance is not new. That part has been around for quite a while. The new part is you used to be able to get an exemption for personal or religious reasons, which you are no longer allowed to do. Numerous lawsuits being filed in California over this, and a few days ago, a federal judge refused to block the new vaccination law, saying, and this is Judge Dana Sabraw of San Diego, saying society has a compelling interest in fighting the spread of contagious diseases through mandatory vaccination of school-age children. The right to practice your religion is not something that outweighs the state's interest in public health and safety. This is a win. This law was prompted by a measles outbreak 2 years ago, which was traced to some kids at Disneyland who had not been vaccinated. The law was implemented last month. This makes California one of 3 states, interestingly enough, California, the liberal bastion, Mississippi and West Virginia are the other two states that have these mandatory school child vaccination laws. It makes California one of 3 states to require school children to be vaccinated. I agree with this completely.
The one thing I wonder when I hear this story is, what is the time frame of this happening? You know, they can move to keep vaccination on a high level, but they can't go move to get the Zika virus, vaccines out there. I don't know. I'm just wondering, did this happen overnight, or is this a long term? And at the same time, do they have the same power to actually to do this for things that are relevant?
Well, I think that there's sort of 2 separate issues here. One is as far as the power of enforcing this. And as we've mentioned, you are only required to provide proof of vaccination in kindergarten and in 7th grade, which means that if you move into this district in 1st grade, you would not be required to provide proof of vaccination until 7th grade. So you're sort of getting at, first of all, the logistics of the implementation of the law, which many people have talked about. But there's the other element I think you're getting at, which is this is a law which seeks to sort of put in some bureaucratic requirement to ensure vaccination in some areas. But meanwhile, we seem to be having a problem effectively dealing with Zika. Is that sort of the point you're talking about?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, legitimate point. I think it's sort of the passing of this law does not directly impact the research that is being done with Zika. So I think that the sort of we can walk and chew gum at the same time type of thing. This is one person walking and then a different person chewing gum. So I do think that we can work on both things in parallel. And the anti-vaccine movement continues to exist among both of those areas. We see the anti-vax movement getting involved in the Zika research, and we see the anti-vax movement obviously overwhelmingly involved in what's going on with California vaccination. Really great piece, by the way, by former segment producer and intern Sam Miller on our YouTube channel called Anti-Vaxxers Have Been Around as Long as Vaccines. Take a look at that to really understand the history of the anti-vaccine movement. This decision in federal court in California, absolutely a win. We will take a break and be back with Thomas Frank next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Thomas Frank, author of Listen Liberal, What's the Matter with Kansas, as well as a number of other books. It's so great to talk to you. I've been following your work for some time, and one of the elements of your recent writing, your recent book that I'm interested in, is sort of your critique of the Democratic Party for really a number of reasons, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so sort of let's start there. When you look at the 2016 Democratic Party, what are your critiques from a sort of left progressive perspective?
Well, I would actually go back, I would say it's a historical critique, that goes back a number of years. But, and by the way, I should have said at the start, David, it is great to be here.
Thank you.
Where Listen Liberal really starts is with my disappointment with the Obama years, because like many people, I had very high hopes for Barack Obama. I thought he was entering the presidency, taking office at a, really critical historical moment for our country. I thought, you remember what it was like in 2008 and 2009. I thought that he was our generation's Franklin Roosevelt. I thought this was exactly the right man to deal with the horrible situation that we were in at the time. With the basically the economy no longer functioning, and the financial crisis and the beginning of the Great Recession. And what he did instead was he basically continued the Bush administration's policy towards Wall Street, at least for the critical first couple of years. And in his time in office, he's achieved a number of things. The main one being Obamacare. But you look at his time in office, and inequality has grown worse and worse in this country. So it is true that the economy has recovered, at least by all the formal measurements, right? The Dow Jones Industrial Average is, at all-time highs. The stock market is doing well across the board, as a matter of fact. Things are the economy is growing. It's not doing great, but at least it's moving again. But for average people, it's as though the recession never ended. We've got this kind of curious situation that we're in now, where something fundamental has changed about American life. And Obama himself has talked about it, right? He's the one that says that inequality is the great issue of our time. Obama himself talks about it very eloquently, but he hasn't been able to do anything about it, or he hasn't tried to do. He's failed to do essentially what needed to be done. And that's the starting point of the book. I wonder why that is.
So let's see if we can break down a few of these ideas into component parts. I mean, I think there's no question whatsoever that any self-described progressive would look at the totality of the Obama administration and say, I can find victories, but I also find a by and large continuation of the broader status quo. And this is sort of related to the narrow scope of what even counts as valid debate in politics in the United States. Is it slightly left of center, or is it to the right of the center? But I would couch it sort of in a different way, and I'm curious what your reaction is. And I know that in the book, you reject the idea that President Obama's lack of more progressivism can be attributed to Republican obstructionism. I know that that's not an idea you find particularly valid or you support. But my question is this, which is, given the pace at which we know the American government moves and gets things done, and given the reality that Republican obstructionism, or the broader huge American apparatus of government that exists, can't we say that given what one president could do in 8 years, there's a fair number of accomplishments that even someone like, for example, Ted Kennedy, who had an incrementalist approach, would say, we've taken a lot of steps to the left?
Well, so no, I think that he could have done a lot more, and I think that the country would have been behind him in doing a lot more. The country was certainly behind him in 2008. You remember those enormous rallies?
Yeah.
I mean, this was a guy who had the wind at his back, and he had majorities in both houses of Congress, and he had these, Chicago tough guys like Rahm Emanuel with him, who knew how the system worked and knew how to twist arms. And, and he came away with, given that, he came away with quite little, in my view. Now, so I don't downplay Republican obstructionism. I wrote a whole book about Republican obstructionism called "The Wrecking Crew" a couple of years ago. I mean, this is an important fact of life in Washington, D.C. What's fascinating to me is that when Barack Obama came into office, he pretended he had never heard of this. The problem of Republican obstructionism. Like, this was a surprise to him. When he reached out to people like Chuck Grassley, on Obamacare, and let this guy basically sabotage the workings of. You remember this? When it went on, it dragged on for weeks and weeks and weeks, while he waited for Chuck Grassley to sign off on some part of it so that he could claim it was bipartisan. It's like he had missed all of the 1990s, that when Newt Gingrich made obstructionism basically the philosophy of the Republican Party. And so that was, I know that being bipartisan is supposed to be the last word in sophistication and pragmatism, but this struck me as really naive, especially given that Obama could easily have, turn to any of the people around him, including someone like Bill Clinton, who knew about this stuff firsthand. And, Bill Clinton, who's not a man that I admire, but plenty of people, and all I'm saying is lots of people in Washington know about Republican obstructionism. It should not have been a surprise to him. Coming into office in 2009, though, he should have, there were all sorts of ways to deal with it. For one thing, he had majorities in both houses with a simple sort of structural adjustment in the Senate. Even the filibuster wouldn't matter anymore. Something that I think, by the way, is long overdue. They should have done away with the power of a minority of senators to stop legislation. That should have been done a long time ago. Obama was a senator. He knew this. you know, that he then gave Republicans, essentially handed them veto power over his own program when he didn't need to, when there's no structural reason to do it. That that's his mistake. That's not that's not the Republicans per se. We know what they're going to do, right? We always know they're always going to do the same thing. We know what they're going to do. That's his mistake. That's his blunder. And or is it a blunder? That's what I started wondering after a while. I mean, when you look at something like the way that Obama dealt with the banks, where it's not, the TARP was already passed. He had the power of the U.S. Treasury. Had just bailed out all the big banks on Wall Street and so many of the smaller regional banks in this country. He had complete power over these institutions. He could have done whatever he wanted with them. He had seats on their board, for Pete's sake. He has votes in the banks, or he did at the time. It's all gone now, but he could have fired the management, as he did with General Motors. He could have, forced them to divest lots of their parts of their operation. He could have shut certain banks down, put them into receivership. All of these things were totally within his power, and he chose not to do them. And that's the critical thing. When you look at the Obama administration, and by the way, I confess to being guilty on this. I want to believe the best about Barack Obama. This is a man that I admired enormously at one time, and that I admire still. I saw him at the Democratic Convention, and every time he speaks, I'm just like, I'm blown away by this guy. I think he's the greatest, okay? At the same time, we do everything in our sort of critical power to let him off the hook for what he did as president, and I don't think that's responsible. I don't think that's responsible. If we're going to be critics, if we're going to write about politics, we have to take ideas seriously. We have to take history seriously, and we have to take what the president does and says seriously. And I think that at the end of the day, the only thing that you can conclude, what you have to conclude, looking at the Obama administration, is that he did what he did not because his hands were forced by this, power or that power, or this inability or that inability, but because he chose to do things the way he did.
Well, I think that gets to, and I had a couple other things I wanted to broach, and we do have limited time left. I think this gets
I'm sorry. I talk way too much. I apologize for that.
This
I
is
go
one of
on
the
and on and on about these things.
Areas I sort of wanted to get to, which is in reading your book, I get the more general sense that your critique of the Democratic Party is at least partially based in the reality that the Democratic Party, while more to the left than the Republican Party in the U.S., is still fundamentally a pro-capitalist party. Is that underlying some of the critique that you're outlining?
Well, yes, of course, but it's not just that they're pro-capitalist. I mean, everyone is that. It's that they're pro a certain kind of capitalism. Okay, so let's never forget when we talk about the kind of, whatever you want to call it, turbocharged capitalism or neoliberalism, or basically the deregulated, modern free trade era that we're living in, that we like to go back and blame it on Ronald Reagan, and that is, I think, fair. Ronald Reagan is really, and Margaret Thatcher is really where this modern era of ours begins. But the man who put this agenda into effect more than any other president, more than any other figure, is Bill Clinton, a Democrat. Okay, this is the man who, President Reagan tried to overturn Glass-Steagall, and he chipped away at it. But it's Bill Clinton that got the job done. If you look at Bill Clinton's presidency, all of these deregulations, the deregulations of the banking industry, that's Clinton that did that, not Reagan and not Bush. This is Clinton that achieved those things, and his staffers would boast about that. And it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just overturning Glass-Steagall. There's a whole series of bank deregulations while Clinton was president. The free trade deals, Republicans, yes, NAFTA was their idea. It was a Republican idea, but it took a Democrat to get that passed. It was Bill Clinton that got that through Congress. And that was Bill Clinton then who proposed, all of the free trade deals after that. And then you look at chipping away at the welfare state. Reagan tried, but he couldn't get very far. It was Clinton that did away with the welfare system in this country, AFDC. That was, a New Deal program. That was Clinton that did away with that, not Reagan. And in some ways, it's only possible for a Democrat to do these things. But when you talk about the grand sweep of neoliberalism in this country, he is the central figure. We have to acknowledge that among ourselves. And the question becomes why? Why did Democrats, why did the party of Franklin Roosevelt, why were they so keen to sign on to this agenda? And that's the larger question that I tried to answer in Listen Liberal, going back to the 1960s and 1970s when they started to embrace this ideology.
Well, the book is absolutely fascinating. It is Listen Liberal. It's a book that both has been talked about very positively, but also negatively by self-described progressives in my audience, because it does bring up a number of different, very interesting and controversial issues. We've been speaking with the book's author, Thomas Frank, and I encourage you to check out the book. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
The pleasure is all mine.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I want to be happy about the so-called basic income experiment that is being done in Finland, but it is really set up to fail, and I'll tell you why in a second. We've been talking about basic income for a long time, and there are many, many movements which, as part of the worldview that they espouse, really point to basic income as something we should be seriously considering. There's the post-scarcity theorists who say we are really heading towards a world where basic goods, including food, even services like shelter and healthcare, have no real need to be scarce and therefore don't even really need to be in the for-profit world. And we should really put a basic income as part of our worldview so that we can disconnect some of these activities from needing to have a, quote, formal job. There are those who have been following the job automation movement and the reality that technology is now destroying more jobs than it creates. If you realize that as a planet, we are going in the direction of fewer industries even having available jobs, a basic income fits there as well. The other scenarios, there are also some other scenarios we've talked about that point to a basic income. Great. So Finland is going to sort of move forward with a basic income trial. The Ministry of Social Affairs and Health has put together a bill proposing a basic income experiment to test the effects of these guaranteed, non-conditional cash payments for individuals in the country. Huge, fantastic, right? Not really. They are going to select several thousand individuals who are already receiving unemployment benefits, and they're going to say, okay, instead of unemployment benefits where you are expected to be looking for a job and these are of limited time and they're also conditional based on fulfilling certain requirements, job training, job hunting, etc., we're going to change it. And instead, you're going to get 560 euro per month and you don't have to do anything. This is unconditional money where you can just get this money, you don't have to be looking for a job, etc. And then they're going to see how many of those people ultimately get jobs compared to the people who are on the conditional unemployment. What on earth are you going to prove by this? If you're really wanting to do a serious test of basic income, you need to take a sample that includes, for example, if you have 5% unemployed in the country, you have another 5% who are underemployed, and then you have 15% who are retired, for example, and 75% who are in the workforce full time. You need to give the basic income to a representative sample. 75% of your sample needs to be working full time. 5% of your sample needs to be working part time, but wanting to work full time, etc. You're not going to prove anything by taking people who are already on unemployment benefits and saying, now you're going to be put on unconditional cash payments and you have no requirement whatsoever to get a job. This seems to me like an experiment, Jason, that is set up to fail, because what's going to happen more than likely is you're dealing only with a group who already doesn't have a job, and you're going only to that group and saying, now you don't even need to look for one. I don't know how this could possibly be a success.
The only thing I can relate it to is I know I was hearing an article about the flood in Louisiana and how these people are without job, without home, etc. And part of the unemployment process is they have to go to, I think, 1 or 2 days a week, they have to go to unemployment, like how to become employed meetings. So I'm not sure if this is part of the catch-22 or they don't have to go through this kind of pseudo looking for job process and they can actually look for jobs. The only thing I can maybe think of that may be the only silver lining here. But
that's amazingly optimistic. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, which is if some of the mechanisms that are required to stay on unemployment actually take up time and prevent you from really looking for jobs, freeing people from that might actually get them to go and spend more time looking for jobs. The paradigm of this test is completely wrong, especially when we're considering that much of the basic income theories aren't predicated on the idea that we would use income in order to get more people working in the traditional types of jobs that we know to exist now. The point is to look at basic income as an element of the significant changes that are no doubt going to happen to society over the next 50 years. I think this is a bogus way to test this. I guess it's good to be doing something. I think it's set up to fail. And if you disagree, I definitely want to hear from you because I don't get how we're going to get anything positive from this test that Finland is doing. I have some bad climate change news from both the North Pole and the South Pole. First, in the South Pole. In Antarctica, scientists have been watching a growing crack in a major ice shelf called Larsen C, which is slightly smaller than Scotland. It's a 350 meter thick ice shelf that's floating on top of ocean waters, and the crack has grown to 30 kilometers in length from 2011 to 2015 and widened by 200 meters in the last few years. And in the last 6 months alone, this has accelerated even further, growing another 22 kilometers in the last 6 months. It may only be a matter of time before we see the loss of a huge chunk of Larsen C. This would be a historic event. This would drastically impact the oceans. It would not be good. It would be yet another sign of the very quickly, drastically negative effects of climate change. The amount of ice that could be lost would be around 6,000 square kilometers. Now, that's the South Pole. In the North Pole, things are not really any better. Scientist Peter Wadhams believes that the summer ice cover at the North Pole is about to disappear, triggering even more warming of our planet. He also adds that most people expect that this year we will see a record low in the summer ice cover. This has huge potential impact, and it impacts the entire planet. One issue is what's called albedo feedback. Sea ice reflects a lot of solar radiation back into space. Water reflects very little. Ice reflects about 50% of solar radiation, water only 10%. So you might say, okay, yeah, well, but ice up in the North Pole, I don't really care. That's not going to affect me. Well, not only are we talking about sea level rise due to melting ice, but we're also talking about significantly more solar radiation actually staying here on our planet. And whenever we talk about melting sea ice, Jason, there are the climate deniers who say, David, people have been scaring us about the no sea ice in the North Pole during the summer for 10 or 15 or 20 years, and we still have some every summer. We have less every summer, and there's no indication that that trend is changing. So for me, when someone says, but that's been predicted for a long time and it hasn't yet happened, well, we're getting closer every single summer. Are you suggesting we wait until there is no sea ice whatsoever before we take action? It seems insanely short-sighted.
Yeah, all these climate deniers are just, ostriches keeping their head in the sand and pretending nothing's going to happen. One thing I like to look at, or I have looked at in the past, there's a story about Mont Blanc in France and these glaciers there. And you can see, I think it was the 80s, the 90s, the zeros, then the teens. And it's not even there anymore. And, just 30 years ago, it's this massive glacier with huge rivers. And now it's almost drought status there.
Yeah. And, as an individual, bringing your own grocery bags to the store and biking to work, that's fine, right? But and to the extent that it makes someone feel like they're doing their part, I support that. And if everybody did that, that actually could make a difference. But we're talking about a planet with billions and billions of people here, and we need major, major change. I'm not laughing off people who bring their own grocery bags to the supermarket. I do it myself. But what I'm talking about is that we really need way more of a sense of urgency here. We have a voicemail number, and that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail that came in that I'll play for you.
Hi, David. I wanted to thank you very much for tackling the cannabis situation here in America. It was a topic that needed to be addressed, and you addressed it. I also wanted to commend Jason on his stand that he's not voting. I personally have not voted since the 80s. You know, it's who counts to vote, not who votes that counts.
Okay. I'm preparing a whole presentation from the audience on Jason not voting. By the way, this is a guy who initially was known to us as Homeless Daryl. Then he became known to us as Diabetic Daryl. Then he became known to us as Daryl in a ditch, Daryl in a field, Scrub Okie Daryl. We haven't heard from him for a while, and it's always good to hear from him. We like to know that he's still listening to the show. Always good to hear. We're going to deal with Jason and his skepticism about voting in national elections a little bit later. On the bonus show, we will talk about another drone being shot down, this time by a 65-year-old woman. We will talk about the dawn of the human-influenced age, and we will also talk about a mom who spent 35 days in jail for bouncing a $29 check. Sign up and get instant access to the bonus show at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.